Hey guys, in our last video we were going through setting up user authentication, and in this video we will be looking at setting up roles to help us to further control who can access what. Now there are a few things that we need to do. Roles would already be enabled by virtue of the fact that we have individual user accounts and we already set up the database for user authentication. So we just need to have a few more tweaks and we will get our roles based or our role separation intact in our application. Okay, so we'll start our journey in our startup class, and since the last video I actually upgraded to Visual Studio Community Edition 2019, so the interface may look a bit different as I go along, but essentially it's pretty much the same as 2017, which is what we started this course series in. So we start with startup, and what I want to do is actually create a few roles to begin with. So in the context of our school management system, we would probably have an admin, a principal, and let's say a user or a teacher. So we want at least 3 roles to begin with. So what I'm going to do is define a function here in the startup class that is actually going to go ahead and create those roles as soon as the application starts up, since that's what this class is here for. So I'll just go ahead and I'll create a function. So I'll call it create roles and users. And what I'm going to do here firstly is include my application DB context. Do recall that application DB context would have been defined in our identity model right here, and it represents that direct connection, which we call default connection, to our database that is housing our user-based tables. So here default connection is looking right to our database. So what we want to do is initialize an object of that here, because what we want to do is to do a few database operations. So we need to include our application DB context, and I'll call it context is equal to, and then we'll see that it's telling us we need to include something. So a nice keyboard shortcut is Control and dot, and it will show us what needs to happen. We can just click that, and then we say new application DB context. Or maybe you're that var kind of developer, so you could always just say var here. Var context equals new application DB context. Next, we want to enable 2 managers in the form of the role manager and the user manager. So I'm just going to initialize an object, call it role manager. And I'm going to say this is equal to new role manager. And I can just say control dot, which will prompt me as to what needs to be included, so I can just press enter and go right ahead. And I want this to have identity role, which is going to require another inclusion. So control dot once again, press enter. So as you go along, you can just go ahead and include all of those libraries that need to be installed. And this is just a part of the initialization. So you can just go ahead and type along with me, role store and identity role once again. And all of this within the context of context. So essentially we are initializing a role manager and we're passing in the identity role, and we're initializing the constructor, passing in role store with identity role and the value of context here to pass in the database that this role manager should be initialized within the context of. And we'll do something similar for our user manager. So I'll just duplicate that line and just change some of the words. So this will be user manager. This is now user manager. So ultimately it has a similar setup. This would be application user, and this would be user store. and once again, application user, and context remains the same. Now we actually need to put it into action. So what I'm about to do is write an if statement to say that if a role already exists, if a role does not exist, then create it. Well, obviously it wouldn't create it if it already exists. So I'm actually going to create an admin user initially. So if, and I'm going to say not, and role manager allows me to actually to find or run certain role specific operations. So I can say role exists, and this function will actually go into the roles database and the rows table, and check if a role exists by this name. So here, role manager will say if there is a role that exists with the name admin, right? But in this case, I'm checking if not. So I want to say if there is no role admin, then do this. And what I want to do is create the first role. So I'm just going to initialize something of type identity role. And then I'm going to give this role object a name. So the ID would be implied once it goes into the database, but I'm going to give it the name, and the name I'm going to give it is admin. And then I'm just going to say role manager, go ahead and create this role. So role manager, once again, has some role specific operations that help us to manipulate the rows table, so we don't have to do much work in getting data in and out of this table as with regular tables. Once it's a user or roles table, as it would have been generated, then we have certain operations given to us by Entity Framework that help us to manipulate these tables. So now that I have the role, I'm actually just going to create a user off the bat, application user, and I'll do my object initialization, which would then say username. So you could have done that here. You could have just done the curly braces here and then just filled in name equals admin. So I'm just doing it both ways, just in case you're new to C# and you want to see how OOP works. There are certain ways to get around this. So I'll give this username, I'll just give it admin, keep it simple. And the email, I'll set to be admin at shmng, school management for short.com. All right. And then what we won't be able to do is actually just set the password directly here. At least I don't want to, because I would want to actually say var password is equal to, and I'll just say password just to keep it simple. But do recall that our database is actually going to, or at least our functions are actually going to encrypt this password before it actually gets stored in the database. So password is equal to this simple word. I'm just doing this so I can actually remember, but this is very bad practice going forward. So then I'll say var usr, and I'm just creating variables here, is equal to, and then here's where user manager comes in, because now we want to actually create a user. So we call on our user manager object, and then we say create, like we know we can, and then we're passing in. And if you look at the function overloads, you'll see that you can create a user with no password. All right, you just pass in the object of application user, or you can actually create a password, a user with a password, and you pass in the user object or the application user object and whatever the password is in string form. So this function would actually handle that encryption and insertion into the database. So we just pass in our user object as well as our password. And then I'll just add a cursory check here to see if our creation, so anytime you actually carry out an entity framework action or function, usually this function will return some value. So the So the user object here or USR object here will actually have a value. So we can say USR dot succeeded. All right, so it will return a Boolean if it was successful. It also returns a list of errors. So I guess if this is false, then you will get a list of errors. If this is true, then obviously whatever you tried worked. So if this operation was successful, then we can say var results is equal to our user manager once again, and we want to add to role. And after I finish writing this, I'll explain it. User dot ID and the role, which is admin. Or let me start from the top. So we check firstly if there is a role called admin in our roles tables. All right, so role manager is our liaison with our roles tables, and we're just saying, does the role exist, yes or no? Now, if it does not, which it wouldn't at this stage, then we want to firstly create a role object and then fill it in with the data. And in this case, we want to give it the name admin. And then we go ahead and create the role. So the role needs to exist. Then we go ahead and create an admin user. And then we give that admin user a password. And then we say create this user with that password. So now we would have an admin role and we have a user called admin. What we don't have is an association between our user and our role. So that is where this line comes in, where it says if the user was successfully created, right? And if it got this far, then the role would be successfully created. And if the role was created and the user was created, then we want to say if it was successfully created, then we want to add to role this user and that role. In other words, now we want to create an association between this user ID, whatever user ID is now assigned to this object, because once Entity Framework runs this operation, this object is basically updated with the ID coming from the database, and we have the admin role. So this function will actually handle finding out the two IDs and associating them. Now, I think all of this is very important for the admin because admin users are a dime a dozen. Usually you have one to very few admin users. You don't go on creating admin users. However, for the principal or the supervisor and the teachers, it's not that serious. So what we can do is simply check if those roles exist. So I'm just going to say if not role manager dot role exists, and this time I'm going to search for, let's do teacher. So if there is no teacher role, then, and I'm just going to copy this code here, and then I'm going to just paste it there, and I'm going to change the role name to teacher. And there we have it. So once again, on the first run, as of writing this code, none of these roles exist. So this will run and create admin and an admin user. This will run and create a teacher role. And I'm just going to put in one more for a supervisor, which is very similar to that again. Supervisor and supervisor. All right. And I'm just going to Control Shift and B to build and just ensure I have no errors. All right. So we have no errors. And now that we've created all of this, what we need to do is actually call our function in our configuration function, which runs as soon as the application starts. So I'm just going to call this function. I can just copy and paste it there, and then we can execute and watch that our rows get created. Okay, so we got an error here. If you were following up to this point in all of the lectures, remember that we modified our application user object to actually have a date of birth. All right. So as a result, when we're creating this user in our startup, it is saying that we have an invalid date time result. So we need to fix that. So I'm just going to stop this real quickly. And then what we need to do is actually add date of birth here. Birth date equals, and I'll just say date time dot now, which will require me to do a control dot using system. And then we can try this again. Okay, so we see that our application came up successfully. But I'm not quite interested in what's going on here. But quickly, I'll just try and log in as the admin user, which should have been created when this was started up. Okay, so we're not entirely interested in what is on this screen. However, we want to check our database to see that our roles were created. So I'll just go over to Server Explorer, having stopped the debug mode, and I'll say show table data. And we want to see that our 3 rows have been created. And so said, so done. So we have our 3 rows, admin, supervisor, teacher, and the respective IDs. And if I go to ASP.NET users, then we should see our admin user. Okay, I'm not seeing the admin user. I'm going to have to check that out because I'm not entirely sure why. But we can get back to that. So if the admin user was not successfully created, then that means that association was not done either, which would be found in user roles. Right, so there's no association. So at least we have our 3 roles, admin, supervisor, teacher, and we have 2 users here. Now, the thing is, if we wanted to associate them, at least manually, then we just need our user ID found here in this column, and we just need our role ID found in this column, and then we could just put them side by side here manually, and then we would have an admin user versus a teacher, versus if that user ID appears twice with 2 different roles, then that user has those roles that have been assigned. So let's just debug what happened, why our admin user was not created. And I have a strong suspicion it has to do with using a weak password. But I'm going to tweak this code a bit, and I'm actually just going to take this bit here and I'm going to run it before the if statements, just so I can debug what is happening. So I'm just going to set a debug point here because it seems to have created the object successfully. And I'm just going to go ahead and press run and see what happens. All right, so mid startup, we've hit our breakpoint. If we look in our user object, we see that we have, okay, admin, and the ID is already there. And then I can step through using F11, and we go line by line. So we have our password, and then we hit our function here, which should actually create this user and this password. So after I press F11, then it will go to the if statement, which will then say user creation was successful. Okay, so if I press F11 again, then it should go into the if statement and proceed to associate the user ID for that admin user with the role ID. So I'm not entirely sure why it did not work while it was a part of that if statement. All right, so our application is up this time, but I'm just going to stop because I'm not really interested in the application at this moment. And I'm going to go to my database and users and see if my eyes deceived me or not. And there we go. So our user has been created successfully. So that means I should be able to log in with this admin user. And if we look in user rows and we just need to refresh, well, I already did it, but if you're not seeing it, you can just refresh the query and you'll see that you have that association, user ID and role ID. I'm not entirely sure why the code didn't run while it was in the if statement, but the fact is we really don't want it to run again, which is why we would have put it inside this if statement to only happen if there is no admin role. So this kind of code you could actually put into an application. You're deploying it for the first time, and these are presets. Then you can put any preset you wish. You can just create a function, create your presets, and just call the function inside this configuration function in the startup class. Now that we have successfully created some roles and created at least one user in the role, what we want to do is, and this is very, very, very introductory, not best practice at all, but for the sake of example, I'll do it this way. What we want to do is actually modify our registration process to include roles. The first thing I want to do is go to my models and modify the identity model. So the first thing I want to do is go over to models and modify my account view model and find the register model. And I want to add here a property to accommodate roles. All right. So I'm just going to create another required field, give it the display name, user roles, and this is going to be a string, and I'm going to call it user role. You'd also note that in our database, the email and the username would get the same thing. In this case, they don't have the same thing, but for every previously created one, they had the same value. So what I'm going to do is include username as a property when registering and make sure that we set username separately. All right, so I'm just going to put username and change this property to username. Next up, we want to initialize our combo box for the view for registration. So I'm just going to go into my account controller, and what will be happening in this controller is I want to run a query against my roles table to see all of the roles in the table and present them as options for registration. All right. So the first thing I want to do is actually create a property for application DB context, because remember that is how we will be liaising with our database. And I'm just going to initialize it. Having done that, we want to make sure that when the user for our site goes to register and we render the view, we're actually rendering a list or a combo box with all of their options. So I'm just going to call a view bag dot rows, and there are many ways to do this. I'm just going to do it as a view bag and call up a select list, and this will actually come in handy later when we start looking at how we associate files and how we have drop downs. But in this situation, a select list, firstly it takes the data source, which would be context.roles, which would give us all roles, but best practice would have us create the admin users outside of the box, not allow a user to create or register as an admin. So while I'm not doing it as a best practice by allowing the user to choose their role, we can still explore why certain things are just a bad idea also. So in this situation, I would modify my data source and exclude the admin role. So I dot contains admin. So we can say where the name does not contain admin, and then that would say exclude admin, and then we can just put it to list, make our lives easier, and there we would have satisfied the very first constructor where you see that there are 9 of them and we are about to employ one of the 9 that is not this. Now with the select list, you can actually say when it is selected what value you want. So I want the value name, not the ID, and also what should be displayed, and I also want name to be displayed. So if you've ever worked with a combo box in HTML, then you would know that you always specify the value and you specify the text to be displayed. So this is essentially how we're doing it. We're looking at this list of objects of type role, and we know that any variable or any object rather of type role is going to have name and ID. So we're saying we want the name to be the value and we want name to be the displayed value also. All right, and we're doing all of that before we return the view. Now in the view, and I'll just right click this and say go to view, what we want to do is include another form group section for our newly created combo box. So I'm just going to copy and paste that form group, and this would be a label for, and we can change that from confirm password to user role. Oh, and we also have one for username. So I'll just do this twice, and I'll probably put username above email. All right, but let's do one at a time. So let's do username, and we will change that value. So, and this would also be a text box for, as opposed to a password for. So a text box for our username. All right, and then likewise down here, we actually would change this to user role for the label, but we want our HTML helper for a drop down list. So we say drop down list, and then we select our property user role. I'll put that in quotation marks, and then we say that we want to use the select list, and we are using viewbag.roles. So we are implicitly converting whatever values inside of viewbag.rows into a select list. And do remember that that is what we said over here. Viewbag.rows is a new select list. So this implicit conversion should not fail, considering that we already put in a select list there. And then we just have one more empty parameter, and then that should take care of our registration page. All right, so we've modified the get register page and the actual HTML. Now we need to modify what happens when we post back. So when a user actually comes in to be registered, there are certain tweaks that need to occur here. Now, firstly, we now need to modify our username object to know that it is no longer taking email, but it is now taking username because we added that. And then the next thing we want to do is put in an async function to say this dot user manager dot add to role. So now we're actually going to associate this user with a role, and we would remember from the previous activity that what we want is our user ID. So user.id and our role by name, which we would get through model.user role. All right. So we have a bit of an error here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm using await here, so whatever I'm using has to be async. So await async, and there we go. So await user manager, and we are passing in the user ID because the user would have been created from this function call, and if it was successful, then we would automatically sign in. And I mean, you could always tweak this, you could always move this sign in function to after the creation and the association of the user with the role, and then you could reroute to the page. And similarly, if we have to render an error, then what we would want to do is reload our select list, because when the page reloads with our errors, we don't want an empty combo box for the user to have to sit down and figure out, how do I get something back? So we want to reload our view bag with the select list such that when it returns this view, it knows exactly what data needs to go back in. And so we can test this, and ensure that our application works just fine. Now our application is up. Let's try and register a brand new user and see what that experience is like. All right, so now we see that we have username and we have user role with a drop down list. Of course, we could style this using Bootstrap to make it look like a drop down that fits in with the others, but let's go ahead right now. So I'm going to say test teacher, or let's say teacher1, and the email address, and I said email address / username, so we need to modify our model, so we take out that / username. All right, so email address would be teacher@school.com. Date of birth, we'll just leave it at that. Password, I'll use a simple password again. And then user role, you notice that this is blank. However, when I click, you'll see that it actually has values excluding admin based on the query that we wrote to fill this combo box. The reason there's a blank space here is that in our code we did have a blank space in our HTML in the form of this. All right, so that's what that did. It gave us a blank space as the first and default value. So we can go back and complete our registration by selecting our role, and I'll say teacher, and then I click register, and there we go. So I'm just going to save that username password combination for teacher1, and if I click manage or click on the username, you see that you actually have some auto-generated functions for the user here. I won't get into that today, but we can definitely tell that our teacher has been created. And I'm just going to come out of debug mode real quickly, and we skip over to the database and see what role this teacher has been assigned. So if I refresh the users table, then you'll see teacher coming up. So we have that teacher@school.com with the email, and we see that the correct username is coming across based on the changes that we have made. And if I go to the user and roles, then we should see a second role here coming up with the teacher's ID and the teacher's role ID, and there we go. So we have the teacher's ID and we have the teacher role ID, and that is essentially how you go about creating roles. Now, the last thing I want to cover in this video is how you can go about authorizing a controller based on the role. So we had discussed using authorize to say that you are unable to access certain things in a controller or the entire controller if you are not logged in. All right. Now, what we want to do is say if you're not logged in under a particular role, then you are restricted from accessing these things. Now, let's say, for instance, we already have admin, we already have teacher. Teachers usually are the ones who should be looking at the students and their details. The admin might be the IT guy. So admin might not necessarily be able to access all of this. And that may be a far-fetched scenario considering that the admin should be able to do all, but just humor me for this scenario. And let's just say that anything inside of the student's controller should only be accessible to people who are in the teacher role. So on the authorize attribute that is already here on our student's controller, I'm just going to put in open and close parentheses, and then I'm going to say roles. And then you see the IntelliSense is saying roles equal, and then what it's expecting is a string with the roles that should be able to access. Now you can actually have multiple rows here. So you can say teacher, comma, admin, comma, as many as you need. All right. In this case, because we only have 2 users in either role, I'm just going to demonstrate with teacher versus admin. So let's go through this again. A teacher is authorized to access everything inside of this student's controller. We already allowed anonymous on index, so that means an admin or a not logged in person should be able to access index. However, if anybody who is not in the teacher role, logged in or otherwise, attempts to go to details or create or anything else inside this controller, then they should fail. Now let us test that. Now that the application is up, I have realized that there is a bug where if you are in debug mode and you're already logged in, then when you try to do this operation, it will prompt you to log in as though the authorized attribute is not working. So to make sure that you get the most out of this test, I recommend that you log off and you try and log in again. So I logged off and I'll log in, and I'll just show you some changes that I made to the login process, where I changed login from email to username, as usually we ask people to log in with username and password. And in the same vein, in the code, I actually updated the sign-in manager. So this is in account controller, and this is the post login function. I changed sign-in manager.password sign-in async to be model.username. So I updated the login model to have username instead of email, and the sign-in function actually takes the username and the password. So because we're using email as the username up until now, because we added username as a field in our registration process, we want to make sure that we're signing in with username and password, which means the other two users would need to be updated to have usernames that are not the email address. Anyhow, those are some changes that I've made, so you can go ahead and make those changes. But as it relates to us logging in, I'll just log in quickly as a teacher, and then I'll demonstrate that the teacher can go to all students, which allows anonymous, but can also go ahead and go to edit, details, delete, or create. And I'm just middle clicking to open these up in new tabs, so I can show you that each page loads as we would expect, since this person is in the correct role. Now what I'm going to do is sign out as a teacher and then log in as the admin user. And now I'll browse to students, which will allow me, but then when I click on create new, it will prompt me to log in, because my admin role is not allowed to access this page. And so the person is logged in, but they're being prompted to log in again because they're not authorized. So that is essentially how you can go about using roles to control access to different parts of your application, and how you go about in installing roles and customizing them to your purpose. All of this is extensible because different people have different requirements, but this is pretty much out of the box. With minimal code, you can leverage Microsoft's existing roles management system. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.